You ever wonder why democracies are so damn rich? I mean, look at countries like South Korea or Japan or the United States, and all you see is this massive accumulation of wealth. Well, what if I told you this whole time there's a secret economic weapon that democracies have been using to get rich for decades? Well, the secret weapon in question is bank independence. Now, I'm going to use some terms rather loosely here today, but I'm going to refer to these independent banks as independent banks, Federal Reserves, or independent treasuries. Now, those are all slightly different terms, but I'm not going to get into the semantics of what makes them different because that's boring. We're just going to talk about what they generally are, what they generally do, and most importantly, what happens when you generally don't have them. So what makes an independent bank? Well, the word independent here is mostly referring to politics. Independent banks are supposed to be relatively free from political pressure. That means that the people working at them are not controlled by, say, the president. They're not necessarily controlled by Congress. They're acting, well, independently. So what do these independent treasuries even do? Well, many things, it turns out. In the United States, for example, they control the broader money supply. They decide how much of the currency to print each year. They also control things like the interest rate, which is how expensive it is to borrow money. That's an economic tool that's used to either combat inflation or combat unemployment, depending on which is a bigger problem. Obviously, each independent treasury or bank does it slightly differently, but I think the American example is a pretty good one and applies pretty broadly to most of these independent institutions. Now, you might naturally be a little bit suspicious of the idea of putting the money supply in some independent group that operates outside the government, but I'll explain briefly why that's a really good idea, actually. And a lot of it comes down to keeping politicians away from the money printers. Because your average politician, especially right before an election, is going to be incentivized to tweak the economy a little bit for their political gain. For example, if you were a president and re-election was coming up in a year, you might be incentivized to lower the interest rate, knowing that it will temporarily boost the economy at the expense of inflation down the line. But they won't notice that inflation until after the election. So you have this incentive to kind of game up the economy and play up its numbers a little bit right before the votes are cast. When central banks are independent from political pressure, this isn't as big of a problem anymore. It's not the president who controls the money supply, it's the bank. And in a good and functional democracy, there is no legal mechanism for people like the president to force banks to raise or lower interest rates or print more or less money. This is why democracy makes such a big difference, because democracies have these legal systems in which the independent bank can legally operate on its own, free from political pressure, and people like the president or the National Congress or Parliament don't control things like the interest rate or the money supply. Now, I've talked a lot about what happens when you have independent treasuries. Now, let's look at some case studies of what happens when you don't. I'm going to start with Turkey, a country that was supposed to be democratic but has become increasingly not democratic over the last few decades. The Turkish president saw that the inflation rate was increasing in his country, and in order to fix that problem, he decided it was wiser to lower the interest rate. Now, if you know anything about interest rates, you know that that is the exact opposite of what you're supposed to do when there's too much inflation. And every economist told him this, but he didn't listen, and there was no legal mechanism to stop him from lowering the interest rate. And so lower it he did, and what was the result? 70% inflation. Just for a little bit of context here, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the worst that American inflation got was about 9%. So, yeah, that's not great. Venezuela looked at Turkey and thought those were rookie numbers, and their inflation rate could have reached as high as 20,000%, as their very authoritarian regime made some very questionable financial moves. Now, both these examples were relatively modern and relevant, but there is a historical example that blows both of these out of the water by orders of magnitude. Now, that example is Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe had a hilarious, well, not hilarious, because it was an economic disaster, but Zimbabwe had a very dangerous bout of hyperinflation, which is what happens when the government presses yes on the print money button and then presses it a few more trillion times. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation peaked at 79.6 billion%. Just for reference, 79.6 billion% inflation in America would make your average Costco hot dog about $114 billion. Now, of course, I could pay that easily with my heaps and heaps of wealth, but some of you might find $114 billion a little bit hard to come by in this economy. So central bank independence is something worth protecting, which is why when you read news articles about certain authoritarian leading presidents trying to exact power and control over independent Federal Reserves, you should do something about it.